So, after you've read chapter 2, this should help with anything that needs to be cleared up as we talk about what happened. Chapter 2 starts with Dill leaving and the beginning of the school year. Now, it's Scout's first year in school, and she's actually been dying to start school. I know, what a weirdo. But she spent years watching Jem from school because she can see him going to school and in the playground from their treehouse. Atticus bribes Jem to take her to school, but Jem makes sure to tell her to give him some space once they're at school, so he doesn't want his little sister hanging around and embarrassing him. So Miss Caroline is her teacher. She's maybe 21 years old, and it's her first day of teaching. The kids don't trust her right away since she's from northern Alabama, which, without knowing the context, northern Alabama didn't align with southern Alabama and the rest of the South during the Civil War. So they, obviously their parents have kind of communicated to them that you regard them with skepticism. It's clear Miss Caroline doesn't really understand the population she's teaching, since she starts by reading this story about talking cats, and these kids for the most part have grown up doing farm chores and aren't really much for these imaginative stories. So when Miss Caroline reviews letters with the class, their ABCs, Scout tells us that most of the first grade had been in the first grade at least one other year before, and a lot of them had failed it. So keep in mind, a lot of these kids in this class, they leave the school year early to go home on the farm and help with crops, so they don't ever complete a school year and they just repeat it. Now things go downhill for Scout at this point, and we find out that Scout's not the typical first grader, and Atticus is not the typical father. Miss Caroline writes down the alphabet and calls on Scout, who we find out can read, and she's been reading for a while. So when Atticus comes home at night, what happens is he reads the paper. He sits down in the living room, and Scout usually sits on his lap while he reads to her. So at some point, she just picked it up. So because of that, she doesn't think that actually anyone taught her. She just knows how to read. There's this confusing quote when Miss Caroline tells Scout, well, you weren't born reading the paper. And Scout says that Jem read in a book where she was a bullfinch instead of a finch. So what this is actually a pun, a play on words. So on one level, a finch and a bullfinch are both birds, but bullfinch is the name of an author who put together a collection of mythology. So she's a storyteller. So Jem was kind of teasing her that she makes up stories. So Miss Caroline thinks Scout is damaged because her father doesn't know how to actually teach. So Scout complains to Jem about this treatment by Miss Caroline at recess, and Jem tells Scout that he was told by his teacher that Miss Caroline is introducing a new way of teaching that's called the Dewey Decimal System. Now we know the Dewey Decimal System is about how books are organized in the library by number, so Jem doesn't really know what he's talking about, but Miss Caroline is trying out some new methods. So once they're back in class, Miss Caroline is waving cards with words on them at the class, so Scout starts writing a letter to Dill because she's bored, which freaks Miss Caroline out even more, especially because Scout is writing, and they learn to only print in first grade, but she's doing cursive, and it tells her that her dad should stop teaching her. So we find out that, to keep her out of her hair, Calpurnia would have her copy pages out of the Bible in order to earn a treat, and was very tough on Scout for the quality of her writing, so Scout has learned to write. And Scout naturally blames Calpurnia and is mad at Calpurnia for teaching her to write, which is a typical little kid response, right? So after this, Miss Caroline asks the kids who goes home for lunch to raise their hand. So these are the town kids who don't have to walk far, so they go eat at home. She then has the kids who bring lunch, right, the country kids and the farm kids, to put their lunches on their desk, and she goes around inspecting them, and she's happy with some and not happy with others. So she gets to this boy named Walter Cunningham, right? Sees that he doesn't have one, so he lies and says he forgot it. So she tries to give him a quarter that he can pay back. His family has no money. They're broke, so he declines, but Miss Caroline tries to insist and force it. All the kids look at Scout to try to help out and deal with it because he's not going to take the money. Scout gets up and tells Miss Caroline he's a Cunningham, as though that's going to solve the problem and explain everything. She's grown up in town. She assumed that's all she has to say. She has to then explain to Miss Caroline that basically the Cunninghams don't take handouts and they just kind of deal with what they have. So at this point, we kind of step back from the book, Scout reflects on an incident she remembers from the Cunninghams that could be a little confusing. Mr. Cunningham, Walter's dad, at one time needed Atticus's help with some property trouble he was having, but being broke and poor, they couldn't pay Atticus. And what Scout sees is that over time, Mr. Cunningham pays Atticus kind of with items like wood and hickory nuts and other things like that he just brings and drops off. Eventually, they've kind of settled accounts. So Atticus tells Scout that while everyone is struggling in the economy, farmers had it especially bad. And we find that this isn't unusual for services in town. Even the doctor will trade potatoes and stuff for delivering a child. So being a child, Scout really can't explain these things to Miss Caroline in front of the class. So what she ends up saying is that Miss Caroline is shaming Walter since he can't pay her back and she doesn't need any wood. So this makes Miss Caroline mad again, and she brings Scout to the front, and to everyone's surprise, what she does is she actually slaps Scout on the hand with a ruler, and that makes the class crack up until another teacher comes in and chews out Miss Caroline and the class. The bell rings, the kids file out, and Scout sees Miss Caroline kind of slump out her desk and kind of cry into her arms. So Scout, would feel sorry for her, but obviously they haven't had a good morning so far. So what should we take from this chapter? One thing, it's about character development. We learn a little bit more about the dynamics of the Finch family. We learn a little bit more about the community. Remember, everyone we're encountering in the town and the school in this chapter would be Caucasian. But we can see there are already some social distinctions within this group as well. We also see that many children and families have not had as protected of a life as Scout. Even though Atticus says they're poor and don't have a lot of money, we know that some kids have it much, much worse. The Cunningham family will play a more significant role later in the story, so remember them. And we see that Atticus has compassion and understanding for this family. So we're also starting to see the setup for one of the important themes and lessons for Scout in the story. Any questions about this chapter, you can go ahead and leave them in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you when I can. Good luck.